to the second video of the dice making process. Right now we're going to be talking about measuring colors and additives. So for molds, we're going to be using a clear silicone dice mold. It is very important that the mold is clear and silicone because ultraviolet resin relies on light in order to cure. So if you have a solid colored mold like this one, ultraviolet resin will not cure in it because it isn't clear. So it needs the clear or translucent material in order to, have the light penetrate it, go through it, and cure it properly. So it's very important that the mold is clear. It's also very important that it's silicone because that means that, it's flexible, it can go all over the place. It isn't just a hard mold because dice will not be able to get properly out of the mold if it is hard. Or if it is hard, then you're going to need to have a different specific kind of lubricant in order to get the dice out of the mold, which messes with the color and the edges of it as well. So just a clear silicone mold is by far the best option. Our mold that we have here is going to take about 40 milliliters of resin in order to fill all 7 dice. So we're going to just do that, pour it directly from the bottle, add any colors and additives into this mold if you're trying to make a full set. If you're just making a one-off dice, then it's much easier and cleaner and quicker to just pour it directly into the mold itself and not waste material going through the cup. But if you are making a full set, the cup is definitely the way to go. In terms of adding things to the dice, it is a very precarious balance, so we're going to want to be as cautious as possible. So just because you can fit something inside of the mold doesn't mean that you should. For example, this little skull that I have here, it can technically fit inside of the D6, but it's so big that there's barely any room for the resin around it, which means that the resin is not going to set if I have this inside of here, because it can't penetrate the big solid object in the middle of it. So when you have stuff to add into the mold, you're going to want to make sure that it's somewhat small. For example, I have this dice here that you can see it's still a significant object inside of it, but it is small enough that the resin, you can see the resin all around it. The light can get through so it can cure properly. So you're going to want to make sure that the objects that you add to it, while you can add them, just make sure that they're not too big that it messes with the curing process. Another thing that you can add to your dice is going to be dye. So that's just for basic colors. This is the brand that I use. It's a good brand. You get a whole bunch of different colors. They're super concentrated, so you can make a ton of dice with even just these tiny little bottles. So I do recommend that. The dye here is super concentrated, so you only use like 1 or 2 drops. Any more than 1 drop for a single dice is going to be too much. So the color is going to be too dense, and the light isn't going to be able to get through. I'm saying that a lot, but it's very true. It's something to be very cautious of. So yeah, just 1 drop at a time, 1 drop per dice as the maximum, so that, again, it isn't too solid, it isn't too dark, so that it can cure properly. So now that we have discussed all of that, what I'm going to do is walk you through these steps of the process that we've already discussed. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure out our resin, 40 milliliters of it. I'm going to be using slightly under 40 milliliters because I don't have another clear silicone mold. So I don't have enough to make anything else with any excess that I have. So actually what I'm going to be doing is only filling it to 20 and then only making half a set of dice with it. It takes a little while to pour it out, so you want to be just cautious not to overfill, not to underfill. So that's about 20 where we're at right now. I'm going to go ahead and close that up, and then I like to use toothpicks to stir because they're easy, they're disposable, they aren't super wasteful because they're so small. And then what we're going to be doing is adding any of our dyes and colorants that we want. I am going to be doing a dark green dice just because I think that would look cool. So I'm going to be adding 1 drop at a time for the coloring so it doesn't get overpowered, right? So we're going to watch, see as it gets mixed in little by little. So you can see it's still pretty transparent. So I was hoping for someone a little bit more solid than that. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a 2nd drop. You want to make sure that it doesn't get too dark. You don't want to have solid colors. We'll just say that because that's not going to work in your favor when you're trying to set up the dice. So there we go. That's a good color right there. We're not going to pour it in the mold yet, actually. So the mold has to be warmed up before we pour anything into it. So we're going to just go ahead. I have a little heater here, so we're going to set it up for that and for a couple minutes, and then I'm going to pour in the dye. So our mold has been warmed up. We're going to go ahead and keep the heater on the mold for the entirety of the curing process because the resin has to be warm in order to set properly. So now that it's warmed up, what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and pour it in to the mold. I'm going to pour it about, no, I'm going to pour it. So we're going to make sure that it over pours just a little bit so that it forms a little bubble over the top. The reason for that is because we want to make sure that the mold is overfilled, not underfilled, so that it doesn't leave any bubbles or cracks once we put the lid on. And so like the lid and the numbers on the lid form a very nice, solid kind of bubble at the top of it, I guess. And then I'm going to do the D20 as well while I'm here. Right, so we have 3 dice, and I have enough left for the D4 as well. So I'm going to pour that in. It's just going to take a little bit because it doesn't pour immediately. So the good thing about silicone is you can just kind of squish it a little bit, which is going to help get more resin out of the mold than if you had just a hard, solid cup. And then we can always just kind of try and get as much out of here as possible. Make sure that the mold is overfilled enough that it turns out decently. All right, there we go. That's perfect. So what we're going to do now that the molds are filled is we're going to just kind of paint on the top of the lid around the numbers with the toothpick, the corresponding numbers to the dice that we filled. So if you were doing a full set, obviously you would just paint in all of them. We aren't doing a full set, so you just have to match up what dice we have ended up filling with the numbers on here. Remember that it's going to be opposite. I have made that mistake more than once, so just be cautious of that. So yeah, we're just going to fill these in real quick. Just doing a thorough job. So the reason for this is just to make sure that once we put the lid on, there are going to be no bubbles around the numbers on the top of it. All right, so that's all set now. So now we're just going to go ahead and flip this over and then push it down. And that brings us into our next video, which is going to be the curing process.